So I'm really happy to introduce Matthew Miller and Chris Anderson from Cisco to kick us off today. Matt and Chris.
I've always wanted to do this. Good morning, Carlsbad! I grew up just down the street, so it's nice to be hometown adjacent.
Is that awkward?
Omni's been a great venue for Authenticate, and
People
Chris, why don't you kick it off?
Yep. So I'm Chris Anderson. Probably you've known by now. This is the infamous Matt Miller. Hopefully you've seen him across different sessions yesterday. You were doing some emceeing, had a few sessions yourself. So this is the WebAuthn expert, the passkey expert, the FIDO board member, Matt Miller in person. And then I'm Chris.
And I'm also Chris.
So to get started, 80% of breaches leveraged identity as a key component. Now, by quick show of hands, how many of you have seen a number like this? Whether it's through Cisco, whether it's through Verizon, whether it's through your own presentations, and can everybody please just raise your hand? And then raise your second hand. And then it's early morning. Get yourself a stretch. There we go. We got a few stretchers. Awesome.
Are you excited?
So when it comes to this number, I ask myself questions like, why does this number continue to grow? Why does it never decrease? Why, as we spend a week in Carlsbad 2 years in a row and we make incredible improvements to passkeys, we got 15 billion users, why does this number never decrease? It just continues to rise. And we believe there's really three core reasons. There's limited visibility in your entire identity stack. Most identity vendors, whether it's your directory service, whether it's your SSO service, whether it's your MFA service, whether it's your IGA, your PAM, I could keep going on a bunch of acronyms if you would like, but any of those services, they're pretty siloed. They understand what's happening in their own individual worlds. They don't have a holistic view of what's happening across all of them. And you might have a SIM, you might have another service that you try to aggregate all these logs, what you end up with is a bunch of noise. It's not an easy way to say, based on my environment, how am I lining up to NIST? How am I lining up to MITRE? So there's limited visibility that you run into. We're not going to sit up on stage and talk about that one. What we're going to talk about is gaps in protection and frustrating experiences. So when it comes to gaps in protection, especially in the workforce identity, Matt and I spend a lot of our times talking to customers about workforce identity. That's what Duo, that's what Cisco is mostly about. This is a typical environment that I see. This is an organization who has different auth methods by device, different auth methods by users, different auth methods by applications. And what you end up getting is a very strong phishing-resistant authentication in a few use cases. The most common one's probably a managed device because you can essentially enforce it. But when you have scenarios like remote access, or you have scenarios like unmanaged devices, most of the times the best you're going to get is some sort of MFA that's more than likely phishing resistant. And then there's going to be methods and access and devices that you may have no MFA at all. If there's any Linux users out here, this is just an example. I'm not picking on anybody specifically, but they're really hard to protect, especially in offline use cases. So you have gaps in protection, and that gaps in protection can be a wide reasons for why. It could be that it's hard to manage certain devices in general. It's hard to get certain applications that are legacy to upgrade to support these legacy protocols. It's hard for change management. One of the hardest things within large organizations is just general change management of how you're going to do a new authentication. All right, so there's gaps in protection. That gap in protection leads to a frustrating user experience. In many cases, organizations are deploying some of the best security practices that they can think of, that they can afford. And the outcome, though, is that we tend to focus on this destination of let's make everything as secure as possible, and we tend to forget about what are we doing to our actual users, what type of frustrations are we going to give them. I believe Mike, yesterday, if everybody went to the keynote, I think he used the phrase something along the line of, to get to password lists, don't be a jerk. But yet, we're asking users in very frustrated experiences. I'm not calling anybody jerks here, I'll call myself one. But what we end up doing is asking a user to log into their device when they first access it, that very first time. I see some of you have your devices enabled right now. I bet you logged in when you first opened it. Even if it was just a Touch ID on your Mac, you're still doing an authentication. The very next app, if you are not managed, if you are not on the domain, if you are not on the network, that very next app, you're likely logging in again. And then if you're like me, I love Safari. Some applications within Cisco may ask me to use Chrome. I'm switching browsers. I'm being asked to log in again. And then, of course, Cisco, I believe everybody knows this from our VPN days, still really prevalent. VPN uses an embedded browser. You're probably logging in again. And so for myself, just accessing my applications per day, I'm logging in multiple times. And that's a very frustrating user experience to go through. And what tends to happen when you have frustrated users? You have frustrated admins. These administrators are just trying to do their best. They're likely overworked. They're likely understaffed. And they're just trying to get to a spot where they are doing the best they can with whatever service they have. It might be very clunky. It might have a hard policy stack to deal with. And they're just doing the best they can. And they get bombarded with users, with executives. The worst thing you can have is an executive that's really mad about your experience, because if they're not happy, you lose an ally. If you lose an ally, good luck trying to deploy anything else. And so you have these frustrated admins, and the other half of this is that they're trying to deploy, but they're also trying to deal with help desk tickets, right? One of the worst help desk tickets you can get is if you take, I don't have my phone on me. If I take my phone and I chuck it in the ocean, maybe we have a good time tonight at a party, maybe it ends up in the hotel pool because we had an awesome time at the pass list party. Next Monday, when I get back to work, one of the worst experiences I would go through is having to re-enroll inside of my authentication methods, especially if that was my only device that had all of my authentication credentials on it. That re-enrollment is not fun. And so what you end up with is frustrated admins, frustrated users, gaps in protection in general, limited visibility. And so the best part about this morning, though, is we have an expert on stage who's going to tell us how in the world we make this better moving forward. Make it better, Matt, please.
Excuse me. Thanks, Chris. So what I want to attempt to do is to paint a holistic picture of how we can address these gaps in protection and these frustrating user experiences with technologies that are in progress, being developed today. These are not like, gee, I sure wish we had these kinds of technologies. These are technologies that are being actively worked on by major platforms. There is interest, strong interest at all levels of those of us in the industry here to adapt some of these upcoming technologies. And so what I want to do is I want to try and talk about how we can deal with some of the frustrations that admins and users have while also addressing some of the gaps in protection. So here's kind of the authentication status quo. Users, when they come into new user onboarding of some kind, there's often a human-centric identity verification step that takes place. Because humans are in the mix, there is plenty of room for attackers to abuse that process. Additionally, once identity verification is completed, there's often phishable authenticator registration. Think about authorization codes you enter into a site to kick off, registering a push application or a passkey or something like that, or a magic link. All of those are phishable ways of authorizing one-time enrollment that an attacker can also get to infiltrate an admin's systems. Once onboarding is completed and the user is in a position where they can start authenticating, which they will do numerously, many times a day, many times a week. Passwords are, of course, phishable, as are the 2FA that they are often paired with. SMS OTP and TOTP is something an attacker can easily phish from a user to then log in as that user. That's no good. Once the authentication ceremony is completed, then we have the establishment of a session token, a cookie that's set of some kind that can be exfiltrated. A compromised endpoint means attackers can go after those session tokens, put them into place on their machine, and then begin logging in as the user. And so, in every step of the way, there's plenty of ways for attackers to get into your system that's going to frustrate admins. Attempts to shore up those weaknesses are going to frustrate users after they have to go through multiple steps just to log into the application, to Jira, to Figma, to things like that. And so, how can we start to improve this? Well, we've already taken the first step. I mean, the reason we're all here is because passkeys. We have a passion for it in some shape or form, or we're looking to bring it into our systems. And so, of course, passkeys addresses that middle segment with incredible phishing resistance. It sort of turns the authentication ceremony on its head, makes it user-centric, has mitigations in place that prevent remote attacks, to deal with the phishability of that middle authentication piece. I noted uneven availability here. I do want to call out that this is still early days for passkeys. As much as we want them now and we want them everywhere right now, there's still some work ahead of us. We have really cool things that were announced this week, like the credential exchange protocol. Phenomenal. That's going to be great from a usability perspective. That's going to squash all of the stories that people have been publishing about how passkeys is vendor lock-in. We all knew it wasn't, but now we finally have something that we can publicly talk about to help make passkeys available in more places more consistently. So I'm very excited about that. But we can't stop here. And so here's where I'm going to attempt to submit some novel ideas or propose novel ideas. Let's layer some stuff on top of passkeys to deal with the frustrations about how do you keep your session tokens secure. Two standardized technologies that are being formalized in their respective working groups can be paired with passkeys to enhance the security of the user post-authentication. So that session cookie that gets dropped in your browser to keep you logged in to prevent you from having to re-auth time after time, protect it with device-bound session credentials, DBSC. This is a technology being worked on over in the W3C's web platform incubation community group with some very smart people from Google, and I saw it demoed along with Microsoft back in April. I know it's come a long way since then, and so device-bound session credentials will be a way to essentially mark a cookie, protect a cookie with a device-bound key pair, so that if an attacker were to compromise your endpoint and get that session token, it would be useless on their machine because the device-bound key pair, the private key, wouldn't be present for the relying party to verify that that cookie was legitimate. So that's an incredible protection around the session token, which a lot of people, when they want to try and attack FIDO2, FIDO2 as an authentication mechanism is so strong, most of the articles about, oh, we've defeated FIDO2 is like, no, we actually exfiltrated the session token and say you bypassed FIDO2. So don't necessarily agree with things like that. And I think DBSC is going to make articles like that even harder to write in the future. In addition, I put shared signals framework on here. That's what SSF is. The idea that we have a common way for services to talk to each other and publish security events for other websites to subscribe to those, and when they receive those events, they can do something like log out or like push out the idea that you should, if you are an SSO protected application, hey, we've received a signal that this user is in a compromised state of some kind. We should log them out immediately so that we can remediate that. We can help them figure out whether they're legitimate or they're an attacker. So that's another technology that we can layer on top of passkeys to enhance security. But that's not, so you notice the onboarding bit there was not really addressed with any of this. And so this is where we're calling it like this end-to-end passwordless end state, this ideal end state. And so how can we strengthen onboarding? Verifiable credentials. You know, if you've not really heard about it, in the passkey space and the verifiable credential space, the identity space, are kind of two separate camps now, but they have a lot of overlap. And so if you allow some of those concepts of identity to come in to your organization at the onboarding point, we're going to be having at the browser a standardized API that could be called to request verifiable credentials. Verifiable credentials, simply put, are cryptographically, I keep saying verifiable, cryptographically verifiable documents that are issued by a trusted authority. You can trust, like there is an operation, a cryptographic operation that a website can do to verify it came from a trusted organization. And so once you have that foundation of being able to digitally provide a driver's license to, in the course of an onboarding flow for your website or for your service, like how can you, what can you build on top of that when you have that additional layer of trust in the onboarding process? When during an interview process, you make somebody produce their MDL from their phone during the interview process to verify who they are, and then during the onboarding process, and you can look at it digitally. Instead of them having to go to an office, you have something that goes, ah yes, the California DMV, this person showed the same driver's license. We're gonna then allow them to go through our onboarding flow to register a passkey, because it's much nicer to log in with a passkey than to always have to pull your phone out, scan the code, and show your verifiable credentials. So that also takes the phishing out of onboarding flows, because you're not using magic links anymore. You're not using authorization codes anymore. And so that's very exciting from a sort of enhancing trust from the start of onboarding, so that organizations have a better chance of feeling like they're actually letting into their systems people that they've met before. And that's a very strong feeling to be able to offer up by thinking about passkeys not just as an authentication technology in isolation, but how we can layer on these extra open source standards that are coming about with major investment from all the major platforms to give you this end-to-end passwordless, phishing-resistant way to onboard users and then allow them to continue to access your systems. So I covered a lot of different technologies today. I covered a lot of different domains of expertise. And yes, people like Chris and I, we're deep on passkeys. There are people who are even deeper on verifiable credentials. Many of them are in this room today. So if you have a chance to talk, if that's something that interests you, please, I encourage you to reach out to them and talk with them. The device-bound session credentials as well. There are experts on that are here in this room around this expo or around this conference today. So go ahead and talk with them. These slides will go out in some shape or form. This was my attempt to try and give you starting points to begin looking at these. If anything that I've talked about today, anything that we've talked about today interests you and you think that this could bring value and security and safety and help deal with those user frustrations that Chris described earlier. So thank you very much.